He was the Terran-born First Chapter Master of the Ultramarines Legion's elite First Chapter, the Master Primus of the 13th Legion, and the Equerry to Primarch Guilliman during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy eras in the late 30th and early 31st millennia. Gage was among the first group of recruits to be taken into the 13th Legion on Terra. Marius Gage's origins trace back to the waning days of the Unification Wars on Terra. He emerged from the nascent ranks of the 13th Legion, specifically from the Alpha intake, a foundational cohort of thousands whose creation served as the testing ground for the Gene Seed's resilience and adaptability. The results of these trials were well within the acceptable limits, proving the 13th Legion's viability. Swiftly earning their reputation, the 13th, known to their allies as the Warborn, demonstrated their prowess in the initial campaigns of the Great Crusade, including the liberation of the Segmentum Solar. During this formative period, the 13th Legion, then numbering approximately 8,000 warriors, began to distinguish themselves under the Emperor's direct command, participating in significant operations such as the liberation of Diurnus, the annihilation of the Scorvidian Xeno Empire, and executing a series of successful compliance actions in independent missions on worlds like Lorin Sigma, Sickles Landing, and Nedebla. By the third decade of the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion had begun to forge a distinct identity. By the year 833 of the 30th millennium, their numbers had swelled to an active force of around 33,000 Space Marines, with their primary battle group forming the autonomous 12th Expeditionary Fleet. The 13th Legion's size, self-sufficiency, and stability were such that the 12th Expeditionary Fleet was tasked with the exploration of the densely star-packed inner galactic disk, coreward of Terra. Consequently, when a secession crisis suddenly erupted near the Capitoline systems of the Segmentum Solar, the 13th Legion, being the nearest, responded with unmatched swiftness. The Osiris Cluster, a constellation of 11 star systems situated in the inner part of the Segmentum Solar's second quadrant, had abruptly declared secession from the Imperium. Chartist merchant vessels were seized, naval patrol squadrons of the Imperialis Armada were fired upon and repelled by system defense ships, and Imperial agents were silenced, presumed dead. The worlds of the Osiris Cluster, many of which were technologically advanced upon first contact, had originally been brought into compliance during the 8th year of the Great Crusade with minimal bloodshed, a campaign in which the 13th Legion had played a crucial role. The sudden rebellion of the Osiris Cluster was thus seen as a direct insult to the Legion's honour by its Lord Commander, Gren Vasotho, who vowed to resolve the situation swiftly and decisively. Acting on initial intelligence, Vasotho ordered the 12th Expeditionary Fleet to advance directly to the halo world of Septus 12, leaving behind the slower support elements, including transports and forge ships, guarded by the fleet's less agile combat vessels. The objective was a rapid strike on Cabasset, the sealed hive city located on the night side of Septus 12, which served as the economic and political heart of the Osiris Cluster. Vasotho reasoned that a swift and brutal attack could quell the rebellion in a single decisive blow. The 13th Legion's flagship, Sethal's Thunder, provided close support fire, tearing massive breaches in Hive Cabasset's protective outer shell, through which Vasotho personally led the Stormbirds of his legion into the fray. However, the resistance they encountered was far fiercer than anticipated. The landing force was soon engulfed by waves of human attackers, initially hundreds, but soon thousands, comprising civilians with dead eyes, crudely outfitted in makeshift pressure suits, and armed with a motley array of improvised weapons, including explosive mining charges repurposed as suicide devices. The 13th swiftly adapted their tactics to maximize enemy attrition, but the relentless tide of bodies pressed on in eerie silence, revealing this was no ordinary rebellion nor a typical foe. Determined not to allow his forces to become bogged down and surrounded, Vasotho called for reinforcements and ordered his squads to press the attack, relying on the speed, coordination, and close-quarters superiority of his Space Marines to carry the day. However, unbeknownst to Vosotho, the Legiones Astartes were being ensnared in a meticulously orchestrated trap. As the 13th Legion advanced deeper into the Hive City, a fleet of unknown Xenos origin comprising 5 enormous hourglass-shaped vessels whose structures rotated and shifted like clockwork emerged with alarming speed from within the fiery corona of Septus's giant star. Realizing the catastrophe about to unfold, Vosotho ordered an immediate retreat from the surface. But as his forces fought their way back to their transports, the ferocity and nature of the enemy's attacks escalated dramatically. As the waiting Stormbirds came under a ferocious and coordinated assault, the attackers sought to cripple or obliterate them entirely. From the surrounding side junctures and corridors, fresh waves of civilians surged forth, their intent not to kill, but to overwhelm and immobilize the Legiones Astartes by sheer weight of numbers, indifferent to the staggering loss of life this strategy entailed. Meanwhile, in the void above, the two fleets collided in a violent struggle. The colossal hourglass-shaped Xenos vessels, each dwarfing the mighty Sethal's thunder in size, unleashed searing lashes of elemental particles that scorched and seared the Imperial warships. Any fighter squadrons or torpedoes that ventured too close were engulfed by collapsing gravitational singularities, obliterating them completely. Despite being outmatched, the 12th Expeditionary Fleet fought with unwavering determination, forcing one of the titanic Xenos ships to retreat, leaking strange, luminous vapors from its damaged hull. However, this victory came at a heavy cost, with a dozen Imperial vessels lost, and the Sethal's thunder, now a flaming wreck, spiraling uncontrollably through the battlefield. At this critical moment, terrifying figures began to materialize among the attackers, both on the surface and aboard the Imperial ships. These eerie entities, radiating a sickly internal light, wore baroque biomechanical containment suits and wielded gauntlets that emitted ghostly flames. Their alien minds reached out to crush the will of any who dared resist them. Faced with this new and horrifying enemy, Vosotho issued his final command. The fleet was to withdraw, taking with it as many of the 13th Legion as could be recovered. However, withdraw they must. A new and formidable foe had revealed itself, and the warning had to reach Terra at all costs. Vosotho, accepting the blame for the catastrophic misjudgment, chose to stay behind, leading the rearguard on the surface as penance for his error. His last act was to transfer command of the Legion to the highest-ranking surviving officer in orbit, Marius Gage. It was a testament to Gage's quick thinking and tactical brilliance that he managed to hold off the enemy vessels long enough for every surviving Stormbird to escape the planet. He executed a complex, three-dimensional battle of maneuvers, feints and retreats, keeping the colossal enemy ships at bay until the 12th Expeditionary Fleet could safely withdraw. What could have been a total disaster was mitigated into a harsh defeat, but at a grievous cost. The 13th Legion suffered the loss of over 6,500 Space Marines, the largest casualty count in any single battle in their history. This represented roughly a fifth of their fighting strength, and among the fallen were many of the Legion's elite, including numerous Terran veterans from its founding and their Lord Commander, Gren Vosotho. The fleet also endured severe losses, with a quarter of its warships destroyed or irreparably damaged, including the flagship. Equally painful was the blow to the Legion's pride and honor, for their overconfidence had led them to this devastating defeat. They yearned for vengeance, but even this was denied them. When the 13th Legion returned to the now quarantined and blockaded Osiris cluster, less than a standard year later, reinforced by the Solar Armada, elements of the 18th Legion, and specialist anti-Psyker cadres from Terra, they found only desolation. The once inhabited worlds were now either barren wastelands strewn with the unburied dead, or plunged into chaos and civil strife. Of the Xenos entities, designated by the Ophiciobiologists as Osiran Cybrid, there was no trace. The subsequent campaign, brief and devoid of glory, saw the Osiris cluster brought back under Imperial control for eventual repopulation. The 13th Legion, now under Marius Gage's leadership, swore a blood oath to seek vengeance against these Xenos wherever and whenever they might reappear. The Legion reorganized, swiftly replenished its numbers and supplies and redoubled its efforts in service of the Great Crusade. Each new victory was an attempt to prove that the defeat at Septus was an anomaly, a mistake never to be repeated. The name of their fallen master, Grenvasotho, and the battle in which he perished became unspoken, a shadow that lingered at the edge of their consciousness. Barely a year had passed when the 13th Legion was joyously reunited with their long-lost Primarch Guilliman, who swiftly assumed command of the Space Marines of the 13th. The Legion received this monumental development with profound pride and celebration, honoured by Guilliman's acceptance of their allegiance. The eloquence and vision with which their newly found Primarch articulated his plans for the future and the justness of the Great Crusade infused the Legiones Astartes with renewed vigour, dispelling any lingering doubts and ensuring a transition of power that was, according to official records, nearly flawless. In recognition of his exceptional deeds and outstanding leadership in the face of overwhelming odds, Marius Gage was appointed as the first chapter master of the elite first chapter, and Master Primus of the newly christened Ultramarines Legion. Under Guilliman's leadership, beginning in the 4th decade of the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion was transformed into a complex and highly efficient instrument of war, building upon an already impressive record of victories with few blemishes of defeat. For more than half a century, the Legion had grown ever stronger, executing compliance actions and liberating worlds for the Imperium across the eastern reaches of the galaxy, all while forging the realm of Ultramar. Yet despite these triumphs, Guilliman was acutely aware that a shadow of doubt lingered over the Legion's soul. This doubt had its roots in the dark memory of their defeat during the Osiris Cluster Rebellion, a few short years before the Primarch's reunion with his Legion. Marius Gage's command had begun with this disaster, and it had cast a long shadow over the Legion's psyche, an unspoken burden that even seemed to affect recruits who were not yet born when the battle was lost. Guilliman knew that the only way to cleanse his Legion of this lingering doubt was to seek out the Xenos known as the Osirian Cybrids and annihilate them completely. To this end, from the moment he first reviewed the reports of the engagement after assuming command, Guilliman had been meticulously planning the Cybrids' destruction. As the decades passed and his Legion moved from one compliance to another, from war zone to war zone, Guilliman never ceased to conduct theoretical battle scenarios against the terrifying and powerful Xenos, knowing that one day they would reappear and that he and his Legion would be ready. However, years went by, and the Cybrids did not return. It wasn't until Maxilla Veritas near the Maelstrom, 26 standard years after the Osiris Rebellion, that evidence of the Cybrids' involvement was deemed credible. Yet, by the time the Ultramarines' fast cruisers arrived, the trail had long gone cold, and the planet's dead offered silent testimony to the Cybrids' passing. Finally, in the closing segments of the year 899, conclusive word reached Guilliman that the Cybrids had not only been encountered but engaged in battle. The Primarch's plan of attack was bold and direct. Without pausing for long-range bombardment or engaging the enemy with broadsides at close quarters, Guilliman ordered a full-scale boarding strike with no prelude. He drove the core of his fleet, along with nearly 100,000 Ultramarines, straight into the heart of the enemy. One by one, the towering hourglass vessels of the Osirian Cybrids were destroyed, either torn apart by explosive charges from within or shattered in the crossfire of the Ultramarines' waiting echelons as they attempted to break free. There was no escape. As the Cybrids fell, so too did their Orc slave armies, still battling on the ground. The battle exacted a heavy toll, several thousand legionary casualties, many of whom were veterans from the Legion's Terran origins, eager to be the first into battle to atone for past failures. But it was a price they willingly paid for the sake of vengeance, and it was a price the Ultramarines Legion would be prepared to pay again in the future. Marius Gage was present at the Calth Conjunction in the year 6 of the 31st millennium, a momentous gathering of both the 13th and 17th Legions. The Ultramarines and Word-Bearers had been summoned to the orbital shipyards of Calth under the guise of launching a joint xenocide campaign against the orcs of the Gazlach Empire. However, this was nothing more than a ruse. The true objective of the 17th Legion was far more sinister. They sought to strike a devastating blow for Horus by launching a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Ultramarines. The Word-Bearers planned to use this element of surprise to completely obliterate their hated rivals, revealing in the process their newfound allegiance to the ruinous powers. Calth had not been chosen as the battlefield by coincidence. It was a deliberate choice by the Word-Bearers to destroy one of the crown jewels of Ultramar, then known as the Ultramar Coalition, just as the 13th Legion had raised Monarchia, the sacred city of the Word-Bearers, on the world of Kur 4 decades prior. Marius Gage found himself aboard the Ultramarines' new flagship, Macrag's Honour, when the captured tender Campanile was hurled into the Calth-Verdian anchor, leaving a trail of utter devastation in its wake. The shockwave generated by the Campanile's impact crippled the flagship's systems, rendering it temporarily blind. In his haste, Chapter Master Gage neglected to open the blast shutters, which had automatically sealed, blocking the bridge viewports. When the shutters were finally lifted, Gage was horrified to witness the catastrophic destruction that had befallen the 13th Legion's fleet. As Vox communications were gradually restored, it became painfully clear that the Word-Bearers had opened fire on several of the Ultramarines' vessels. Upon observing the assault, Guilliman and his officers initially believed that the Sons of Lorgar had committed some tragic error. Some speculated that the Word-Bearers had mistakenly interpreted the destruction of the Calth-Veridian anchor as an enemy attack, and were firing blindly, their systems or senses shattered by the calamity. Others surmised that the Word-Bearers, fearing a repetition of Monarchia, believed the Ultramarines were once again intent on censuring them and saw no choice but to fight for their survival. Despite numerous attempts to contact the Word-Bearers and restore order, even those few vessels with functioning hailing systems failed. Whether by refusal or inability, the Word-Bearers did not respond. From the moment disaster struck, the bridge crew of the Ultramarines' flagship, Macrag's Honour, fought valiantly to restore Vox communication and establish contact with the Word-Bearers. At last, contact was made, though limited to a grainy, flickering hollow projection and a sibilant audio transmission laced with static and feedback. Guilliman demanded that his brother stand down his fleet, swearing to Lorgar that the Ultramarines had no part in the catastrophe that had befallen Calth. But Lorgar had no interest in dialogue. He spat a bitter curse before severing the connection. In that instant, Guilliman realized the truth. This was no accident. With his fleet ablaze and the Word-Bearers relentlessly crippling or destroying more of his vessels by the minute, the Primarch of the Ultramarines gave an order he had never imagined he would have to utter. With grim determination, Guilliman commanded his sons to defend themselves, authorizing measures up to and including the return of weapons fire. Thus began the Mark of Calth. Mark 0 was set as the official time index for the battle's commencement, marking the official beginning of the Battle of Calth. 2 hours into the orbital battle, the Master of Vox aboard the Ultramarines' flagship reported to Guilliman that the Word-Bearers' flagship, Fidelitas Lex, had opened a lithocast hailing channel. Guilliman stepped onto the holocaster platform at the center of his bridge, where the hooded figure of his brother, Primarch Lorgar, materialized in grainy hard light. For perhaps the first time in his life, the famously composed Guilliman was overtaken by fury. He raged at his brother, condemning his betrayal and vowing to exact relentless vengeance. Guilliman denounced Lorgar's sanity and swore that both he and his sons would be punished. Yet more shocking than Lorgar's demeanor were the words he now spoke. With scornful derision, Lorgar revealed that his treachery was not, as Guilliman had assumed, a revenge for Monarchia, nor was it an isolated event. Instead, it was part of a grand, long-conceived scheme of unimaginable scope, one in which no fewer than half of their brother Primarchs were complicit, including the greatest among them, Horus. Lorgar even claimed that 3 of their brothers were already dead, a statement that history would later reveal to be false. Yet Lorgar had every reason to believe at the time. Gilliman was struck speechless by the staggering arrogance of Lorgar's revelation, though he knew, however unpalatable, that his brother spoke the truth. In that moment, Gilliman swore anew to end this betrayal, even if it cost him his life. Driven by a fury that bordered on the irrational, Gilliman's sole focus became the desire to hunt Lorgar down and kill him with his own hands, regardless of whether it was a sound, tactical decision. But fate had other plans. Lorgar's hard-light avatar suddenly contorted, mutating into a monstrous figure ripped from the darkest nightmares. Disgusted by what he perceived as grotesque theatrics, Gilliman ordered the hololith link terminated. Only then did it become horrifyingly clear that the signal had already been severed. The abomination standing at the centre of the Macragge's Honours Bridge, once a mere projection of hard light, had transubstantiated into flesh, a nightmarish creature of eyes, teeth, tentacles, scales, and unreal flesh. The bridge crew and the enraged Primarch were left to confront the chilling reality that this monstrosity was no illusion. In an instant, the entire bridge was engulfed in an explosion of phantasmagoric viscera, the blast shattering its armoured viewing dome and hurling its occupants into the void. In a single catastrophic stroke, the Ultramarines lost their beloved Primarch, and their beleaguered fleet was stripped of its flagship. What followed was unprecedented in the annals of the Great Crusade. While the scions of Terra's great navigator houses had some inkling of what horrors lurked beyond, such knowledge was denied to all others, including the Legiones Astartes. The creature that had manifested on the bridge exploded in a fountain of gore, the force of the blast breaching the hull. Standing at the very centre of the chaos, Gilliman was blown upwards and outwards through the breach, ensnared by the writhing remains of the monstrous entity that had once been Lorgar's lithic avatar. The creature's spiralling pseudopods and motile shadows entwined around Primarch's mighty form, dragging him into the void. The bridge crew had no chance to save their Primarch, nor in most cases themselves. A dozen senior officers were swept up in the maelstrom of blood, debris and howling air, their screams snatched away by the vacuum as they followed Gilliman into the void. Shipmaster Zedoff, the seasoned captain of the Macragge's Honour, was eviscerated by shards of armoured glass, his mangled body torn from his command throne in a storm of flesh and metal. Even the Space Marines had little hope of survival in the chaos. Chapter Master Verd, abandoning all void breach protocol, was seen launching himself into the slipstream of blood and wreckage in a desperate attempt to aid his Primarch. He was never seen again. The first Chapter Master, Marius Gage, managed to grasp hold of a railing at the moment of the breach, pulling himself along the shattered bridge toward the main portal, which was sealing itself against the void even as he struggled forward. Mere meters from the armoured hatch, Gage encountered the gravelly wounded Chapter Master Banzer and dragged his fellow officer through the portal just as the blast doors closed. Banzer succumbed to his injuries shortly thereafter, but Gage had no time to mourn. The destruction of the bridge was but one of the horrors being visited upon the Macragge's Honour. The entire conning tower was disintegrating around him, the deafening howls of bestial insanity echoing through the corridors, accompanied by the screeching of tortured metal, the roar of escaping atmosphere, and the wet screams of the crew being slaughtered. The few who survived the devastation on the bridge, nearly all of them Legiones Astartes, for mortal flesh was too fragile to endure such horrors, were forced to flee downward, pursued relentlessly by death as the conning tower disintegrated deck by deck into the void. Any hope for respite upon reaching the main body of the vessel was swiftly dashed. The barrel-vaulted companionway that spanned the uppermost decks of the Macragge's Honour presented a nightmarish scene, one torn straight from the darkest excesses of old night. Crew members were cut down, their blood and severed limbs scattered in all directions by entities of warp-born shadow and searing Imperial fire. The seasoned warriors among them recognized the signs of catastrophic warp breach, which could induce mass hallucination and psychosis, and some were aware of theories suggesting that certain anti-life forms existed within the shadowed depths of the warp itself. But this was no warp breach, for the Macragge's Honour was in real space. To the beleaguered defenders, it seemed as though the entire ship had been boarded by creatures of an unknown xenotype at the very height of the battle, initiated by the word-bearers. Only the superior mental conditioning of the Legiones Astartes could withstand such a weight of betrayal and horror. Many of the surviving officers quickly concluded that their traitorous brother Legion had unleashed some form of Xenos terror organism as yet another weapon in their arsenal of treachery. However, the Ultramarines had no opportunity to mount a coordinated defense of their flagship, for the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. Human crew members were slaughtered, their minds overcome by primal terror at the horrors they witnessed. Lithe, horned creatures formed from the roiling energies of warp space, with skin aglow like molten lava, wielded wickedly barbed long swords and butchered those too stunned or too slow to flee. Other manifested entities included bloated, plague-ridden corpse things, one-eyed and drooling, wielding rusted cleavers to hack helpless crew members as though they were mere carcasses on a butcher's block. Still others appeared deceptively human, agile and fleet of foot, equipped with vicious claws that they used to eviscerate and gut those who stood entranced by their approach. These and countless other abominations descended upon the flagship, until even the shattered chain of command that had survived the loss of the bridge was extinguished. It was as though an ancient apocalyptic prophecy had come to life, with the Space Marines of the 13th Legion facing nightmarish foes against whom the very laws of reality held no sway. Chaos, bloodshed, and anarchy claimed the interior of the Macrag's honor. The battle devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, as individual warriors were cut off from their comrades, either swept into the bowels of the ship or overwhelmed and slaughtered outright. First Chapter Master Gage and Antony, believing themselves to be the only surviving Legion officers, did what they could to restore order, commanding the crew to go to ground, barricading themselves in any compartments they could find, while ordering all Ultramarines, naval armsmen, and Imperial Army soldiers to rally together. Yet even this seemingly simple order proved almost impossible to execute. Wave after wave of horrors surged through the length of the Macrag's honor, and witnesses later described how the angles of the bulkheads and the spaces between shadows seemed to wrinkle and fold upon themselves before snapping taut once more, revealing savage wounds in the very fabric of reality. It was through these micro-rifts, as they would later be called, that the creatures emerged. Across the ship, individual Legiones Astartes and naval officers fought valiantly to repel the invaders. Falling back on long-established counter-incursion protocols, they enacted what measures they could. Entire sections were purged of breathable atmosphere or flooded with toxic gas. Others were plasma-scoured or subjected to intense heat. But the creatures continued to advance, impervious to effects that would have scoured the ship of any known life form. These failures were compounded by the crippling of the ship's internal command and control systems early in the betrayal, and with so many senior Ultramarines dead and lower-tier officers isolated from one another, the same mistakes were repeated time and again. The Ultramarines' famed ability to analyze any challenge and reason their way to victory broke down entirely, through no fault of their own. Worse still, the creatures shrugged off even the heaviest fire from the Space Marines' bolters and other weapons. They swarmed through hails of gunfire, unscathed, to fall upon the defenders with otherworldly savagery. Their actions followed no discernible strategy or logic. It became clear they had no objective but to shed blood. It was later observed that the creatures seemed more intent on culling prey than engaging in a conventional battle, a chilling observation that many others would echo before the end. As the word-bearers' breacher squads prepared to assault the exterior of the flagship, the battle for the vessel's interior began to shift. Pockets of organized and determined resistance started to form, with individual warriors rallying around leaders who inspired the fight back through their own heroic example. Among the many tales of courage and honor from the defense of Macrag's honor, one story often recounted is that of Sergeant Aenid Teal of the 135th Company. At the moment the flagship's bridge was breached, Thiel was under censure, awaiting a hearing with the Primarch himself, in an antechamber lined with Lord Guilliman's personal arsenal. Confronted by the first wave of attackers, Thiel seized the nearest weapons at hand, an electromagnetic longsword and a Kalatai friction axe, both extraordinarily rare and potent artifacts of lost weaponsmithing arts. Armed with the Primarch's exotic weaponry, Thiel carved his way through a horde of foes, quickly discovering that these creatures were far more vulnerable to the effects of his axe and sword than to his bolt pistol. Thiel, known for his rare ability to think beyond conventional doctrine, had earned the mark of censure for this very trait, the red-painted battle helm that he still wore. Recognizing that these invaders were something other than aliens, psychic manifestations, or unknown xenostrains, Thiel named them demons, understanding that they were, in a very literal sense, creatures from humanity's darkest nightmares. As he fought, Thiel encountered other warriors holding their ground against the waves of attackers. He soon found himself leading an improvised force of several dozen legionaries, armsmen, solar auxilia, and even abhuman stokers, all determined to defend their flagship. He managed to make brief contact with both Imperium and Teutonicus, and together the three coordinated an advance across several decks, converging near the conning tower, or what remained of it. It was here that Thiel came upon the severely wounded first chapter Master Gage, saving the senior Legion officer from certain death at the hands of a warp-born horror that had already severed his right arm. Battling the effects of a warp entity's venom, Gage immediately recognized that Thiel's tactics were proving effective and needed to be disseminated throughout the entire force. Gage agreed with Thiel's observation that the creatures were more susceptible to melee weaponry, though he reserved judgment on the sergeant's theory that this weakness stemmed from arcane rituals described in ancient human myths. Nevertheless, as an experienced officer, Gage understood that, in his wounded state, he could not lead effectively. He therefore entrusted tactical leadership to Thiel, while an apothecary worked to stabilize him. Soon after, the forces under Thiel, Chapter Master Imperium and Captain Teutonicus, were united, bolstering their resistance against the invaders. As the immediate situation began to stabilize, Gage seized the opportunity to gather intelligence from scattered Ultramarines' forces and devise a plan to reclaim control of Macragge's honor. The fate of the Primarch remained unknown, and few dared to dwell on it, fearing that such thoughts might overwhelm them with grief and dull the edge they needed to survive. Instead, the first chapter master ordered the force to make their way to the flagship's auxiliary bridge, located several dozen levels directly beneath the destroyed conning tower. However, this plan alone would only grant superficial control of the vast vessel. True command required the expertise of an experienced shipmaster. Unfortunately, the flagship's captain, Shipmaster Zedoff, had been slain along with most of the bridge crew. Here fortune smiled upon the Ultramarines. Just minutes before the loss of the bridge, Macragge's honor had recovered several salvation craft ejected by the sanctity of Saramanth earlier in the battle. Among the survivors was the ship's captain, Shipmaster Hamed. Though Gage had no way of knowing whether Hamed was still alive or had fallen like so many others, he knew that the veteran shipmaster represented the best, perhaps only, hope of regaining control of the beleaguered flagship. It fell to Sergeant Eonid Thiel to lead the search for the shipmaster. He and his force set out for the primary starboard launch deck, while Gage and Imperium led the remainder of the force towards the auxiliary bridge. The distance was not great, and overall, the tide of invaders was mercifully receding. Yet, many of the warp entities were as powerful as a space marine, with some being considerably stronger, and so reaching the launch deck came at the cost of irreplaceable losses for the Ultramarines. When Thiel arrived at his destination, he found the deck swarming with the same crimson-skinned, horned creatures that he and his warriors had battled in large numbers earlier. The horde was converging on a single point, which Thiel quickly realized, to his horror, was occupied by the survivors of the sanctity of Saramanth. Shipmaster Hamed had survived both the destruction of his vessel and the manifestation of an entire army of warp creatures, yet now, as the tides of horror began to recede, the last of the invaders were descending upon him. In that moment, Sergeant Thiel saw his chance to save Shipmaster Hamed but he knew he had to act without a moment's hesitation. He led his force onto the launch deck, ordering sustained and rapid fire, fully aware that the bolts would do little more than distract the fiends. But distraction was precisely what Thiel intended. As the Horde turned its attention to this new threat, their focus shifted from the cornered shipmaster to the attacking Ultramarines. Thiel then ordered the loading deck platform, where Hamid and the other survivors were standing, to be lowered. The Ultramarines had to keep the warp entities engaged long enough for the platform to deliver the survivors to safety, and so they unleashed a relentless barrage of bolter fire into the Horde, all the while taking measured steps backward toward the deck entrance. Finally, as the shrieking Horde closed to within mere meters of the firing line, Thiel judged that the shipmaster was secure. With a final step back, the Ultramarines crossed through the hatch, and the blast door slammed shut behind them. The enraged howls of the warp creatures echoed through the corridor, their weapons and claws hammering against the other side of the portal. Shipmaster Hamid was safe. As Thiel's force successfully extracted Shipmaster Hamid, first chapter Master Gage, now largely recovered from his injuries thanks to the superhuman physiology of the Legiones Astartes, led his own contingent toward the auxiliary bridge. The route carried them through a section of Macragge's honor that was the exclusive domain of the vessel's Mechanicum contingent, a place that had clearly witnessed intense combat, as the deck was littered with the severed limbs and cybernetic organs of countless tech adepts, Skitarii, battle automata and combat servitors. Gage ordered his squads to slow their advance, remaining vigilant for any lingering warp fiends responsible for the carnage, as well as any potential survivors. It wasn't long before signs of both were detected. At the heart of this area stood a sacred machine fane, a holy site dedicated to the Omnissiah. The chamber was considered the holiest of sanctuaries by the tech priests, with only tech marines, those members of the Legiones Astartes inducted into certain mysteries of the machine, typically allowed to enter. The chamber was sealed by an armored portal towering 24 meters high, and from beyond it came the sounds of weapons fire mingled with the now all too familiar shrieks of attacking warp creatures. Gage realized he had no choice but to breach the sanctity of the machine fane. Though he adhered to the secular imperial truth and had witnessed the worst excesses of religious fanaticism, he was wise enough to respect his allies' beliefs. As the massive gears engaged and pistons expelled great gusts of vented gas, the brass portal ground open, revealing a sight unlike any the veteran chapter master had ever seen. The interior of the machine fane resembled the inner workings of a colossal engine, with a towering altar dominating the central space. Around it, a group of Mechanicum tech priests of various orders unleashed a relentless torrent of fire upon a circle of lithe demons that danced around them. The incense and smoke-filled air was seared by Volkite rays and pulsing waves of focused radiation, yet the attacking creatures seemed almost impervious to these weapons, devices capable of melting the flesh from mortal bones. The demons shrieked and cackled mockingly as they darted back and forth, delivering graceful yet deadly caresses with their long, razor-sharp claws. Upon the Ultramarines' entry into the machine fane, the creatures immediately ceased their torment of the tech priests, hissing in sibilant challenge at this new foe. Where Thiel had ordered his legionaries to fire on the entities to distract them, Gage had a different strategy. With a bellowed command, he ordered bolters to be stowed and hand-to-hand weapons drawn. Combat blades, chainswords and bayonets were swiftly brought forth, and Gage himself brandished the Primarch's friction axe, which Thiel had passed to him, making sure all could see and follow his lead. Shouting the war cries of Ultramar, the squads advanced in perfect formation, engaging the warp-spawned creatures in the measured fury of close combat. Razor-sharp claws slashed from the shadows, lacerating power armor and rending Astartes' flesh. Within seconds, a dozen brave space marines fell, but more stepped forward to take their place in the line. Face to face, the demons were revealed as nightmarish mockeries of the human form, their faces both alien and androgynous. A cloying musk surrounded them, threatening to overwhelm any battle brother deprived of his helm with lethargy or delirium. Inspired by the Ultramarines' example, the tech adepts cornered at the machine altar cast aside their myriad exotic weapons and took up their ceremonial axes and staves. Chanting Binaric war cant across the chamber, the Magos commanded the battle automata and combat servitors to join the fray, and soon the tide began to turn. The wicked glee vanished from the warp creatures' leering faces as they realized their impending defeat too late. Surrounded with the Ultramarines on one side and the Mechanicum on the other, the battle lines pressed ever inward. A minute later, the last of the vile warp things dissipated into nothingness as their phantasmagoric forms were hewn apart by chainswords and crushed beneath the massive fists of the Castellax-class battle automata. Having secured both the shipmaster and the senior Mechanicum Magos, the Ultramarines Legion had gained a tangible chance of reclaiming control over Macrag's honor. It was only when Gage's and Thiel's forces finally battled through the remnants of the warp incursion and converged at the auxiliary bridge that they realized the success of their respective missions. The tense wait for the first squads to arrive at the rendezvous point soon gave way to relief, as it became clear that both forces had achieved their crucial objectives. Almost exactly 10 hours after the breach of the Ultramarines' flagship's main bridge and the apparent loss of their beloved Primarch, Shipmaster Hamed, with the assistance of the two most senior Magos rescued from the launch deck, succeeded in taking command of the vessel. The auxiliary bridge was activated, and the control of the mighty warship was transferred to Shipmaster Hamed. Within minutes, the Vox systems began to come online, and contact was re-established with Ultramarines units on the surface of Calth for the first time since the Campanile's destruction of the Calth Viridian anchor. Under different circumstances, these developments might have been cause for celebration, but the reactivation of the vessel's communications and auger systems brought even graver realizations. There was still no sign of the Primarch. The Legion forces on the surface had suffered catastrophic losses, and of the fleet that had assembled in orbit, barely 1/5 of the original vessels remained battle-ready. Moreover, the full scale of the boarding action against Macrag's honor was now evident. Miraculously, Guilliman had survived the assault on the flagship's bridge and was eventually able to lead an assault on the master control room of the Zetson-Verid fleet yard, regaining control over Calth's orbital defense system. Utilizing the orbital platforms, the Ultramarines systematically exacted retribution upon the Word-Bearer's fleet. One by one, the crimson-hulled warships of the 17th Legion were annihilated. The tide of battle had finally turned in favor of the Ultramarines. Their victory had arrived just in time to confront what seemed like inevitable defeat. Despite regaining control of the orbital defense grid, the Word-Bearers had turned its formidable weapons on the Viridian system's sun, destabilizing it. The dying star cast a menacing shadow as it prepared to go supernova, threatening to unleash a cataclysmic stellar explosion that would annihilate all life on the surface of Calth. As Guilliman assessed the situation, his attention was drawn to a scene below. Half a dozen surviving Word-Bearers were carrying the bloodied corpse of Corferon. Despite the grievous wound inflicted by Guilliman, who had torn out his primary heart, the wretched first captain of the 17th Legion remained alive. As the Ultramarines raised their bolters to fire upon the retreating Word-Bearers, their forms shimmered and vanished in a cascade of teleporter energy. Guilliman then contacted First Chapter Master Gage aboard Macrag's honor and issued a direct order: hunt down the infidus Imperator at all costs. Guilliman was determined that Corferon would not escape his ultimate fate and return to plague the Imperium. Though concerned for his Primarch's safety, Gage was informed that Guilliman and his forces would secure one of the Ultramarines' vessels docked at the Zetson-Verid yard. Meanwhile, the Word-Bearer's grand cruiser Infidus Imperator began to turn slowly amid the debris-rich field of Calthian near-space, surrounded by the flaming wreckage of countless starships. Engaging its main drive, the cruiser initiated a long, hard burn toward the outer reaches of the Viridian system. As it accelerated away, Macrag's honor turned in pursuit, setting the stage for one of the most infamous naval duels in Imperial history. Following his Primarch's orders, Marius Gage immediately set the Macrag's honor in pursuit of the infidus Imperator. As the chase unfolded, 3 word-bearers cruisers moved to intercept the Ultramarines' flagship, attempting to buy time for the infidus Imperator to escape. With the assistance of acting shipmaster Uon Homed, Chapter Master Gage unleashed the flagship's firepower, destroying 2 of the cruisers with the first volley and crippling the third with the second. Meanwhile, Corferon, having survived his confrontation with Guilliman, awoke from his grievous wounds and promptly ordered the infidus Imperator to turn and confront the Ultramarines' flagship. Sensing an opportunity to end the duel, Gage commanded the Ultramarines to prepare boarding parties to capture and destroy the infidus Imperator from within. Leading the assault was Captain Arian Merzeror, accompanied by a cadre of veterans in cataphractii pattern Terminator armor. The 2 warships drew alongside each other, exchanging broadsides in a fierce exchange of fire. Gage ordered the launch of boarding torpedoes, docking claws and siege bridges, unleashing thousands of Ultramarine legionaries into the infidus Imperator. The initial assault by the Ultramarines progressed well, as they quickly gained ground aboard the word-bearer's vessel. However, the Sensorum on Macragge's Honour's bridge suddenly detected a build-up of unknown energy. The Ultramarines soon realized they had been deceived when they saw Chaos cultists concluding a dark ritual. As the ritual reached its climax, a massive burst of warp energy shook both warships, causing severe damage throughout Macragge's Honour. The ritual also summoned word-bearers, legionaries and demons who materialized within the bowels of Macragge's Honour, sparking brutal fighting aboard the Loyalist vessel. While leading squads of Ultramarines to repel the boarders, Chapter Master Gage encountered a greater demon. Recognizing the need to purge the flagship of these malefic intruders at all costs, Gage and a squad of Ultramarines launched a desperate charge against the demon. As the Ultramarines fought to regain control of their vessel, the infidus Imperator began to break away, tearing apart the bridges connecting the 2 warships. After regaining control of Macragge's Honour, Gage ordered power to be diverted from both the weapons and void shields to the engines in order to pursue the fleeing word-bearer's vessel. He reasoned that the infidus Imperator lacked the time to calculate a warp jump, and was still too close to the gravity field of Calth to safely translate into the Imperium. However, Corferon had another plan. Using a shard of Erebus, Corferon sliced open a hole in real space in front of the infidus Imperator, allowing it to enter the warp by arcane rather than technological means. Despite the protests of Shipmaster Homd, Gage ordered the pursuit to continue, throwing caution to the wind. Following in the infidus Imperator's etheric wake, Macragge's Honour translated into the warp. Upon successfully entering warp space, the Ultramarines quickly established visual contact with the fleeing infidus Imperator, even as their navigator struggled to detect the traitor warship. Realizing that the flagship would lose track of its quarry without maintaining visual contact, Corferon directed his ship through a shoal of dead suns in an attempt to shake off the pursuing Ultramarines. During the chase, Macragge's Honour was abruptly halted by a collision with a warp anomaly, which resulted in millions of warp entities swarming the beleaguered vessel. Recognizing that these anomalies were breaching the ship's Geller field, Gage ordered the Ultramarines to the void locks to cleanse the demonic intruders from the hull. In the process of purging the flagship's hull of demons, Macragge's Honour lost sight of the infidus Imperator. Seizing the opportunity, Corferon launched a vicious counterstrike, inflicting severe damage on the Ultramarines' vessel. Gage responded by ordering the weapon batteries to be charged and loaded, firing a broad spread in the hopes of striking the word-bearer's ship. At the last moment, a contact was detected. Captain Merzeror, having survived the word-bearer's summoning ritual, activated his homing tracer, providing Macragge's Honour with a signal that allowed it to lock onto the traitor vessel. Diverting all remaining power to the weapons, Macragge's Honour unleashed a devastating volley, stunning Corferon and disrupting his attack run. To ensure the infidus Imperator was utterly destroyed, Gage ordered a second volley, annihilating the word-bearer's vessel and ending the pursuit. However, the victory came at a heavy cost. Macragge's Honour, having sustained tremendous damage during the battle, was left stranded in the warp. Gage realized that it might take many standard years or even multiple lifetimes to return to the realm of Ultramar.